everyone, I'm Captain Logan and welcome back to the Jaded and Misanthropic Comic Vault. Today, we return to Amalgam-land and we're taking a look at Legends of the Dark Claw #1, the mashup between Batman and Wolverine that was published at the same time as DC vs. Marvel. And in fact, the very next year, the companies came back and did more Amalgam stuff. They did the same stunt again with another smattering of books, but without doing another big crossover event miniseries. They just did more of these. And there's a second Dark Claw book, issue, I should say, in that group. I'm not going to review these in any particular order, except I'm probably going to do all of 96 before I do 97. But I wanted to start with Batman with Dark Claw, because this was one that I remembered kind of liking a little bit when I was a kid and thinking the art was pretty cool. And looking at it again, there's certainly some typical kind of corner cutting that you see in this issue, like you do with a lot of 90s comics, where there's not a lot of stuff going on in the background. But at least Jim Balent isn't giving us usually just straight up like empty backgrounds with just one solid color. He does a little bit more than that, but I like his character designs in this, although I don't know how much of it he got to design, because some of these characters, including Dark Claw, you see in the first place in a big panel at the end of the third issue, as we talked about yesterday, with DC versus Marvel / Marvel versus DC. And I don't know who exactly designed each of the costumes, or if it was a coordinated effort where different people working on different books. That's the thing I'd like to know. If anybody knows that, that's a thing I'd like to know. Like if it was that, or if it was that everybody got to design their own characters and then those designs went into that big spread, because the Amalgam characters aren't used at all besides just showing them off and a couple of pages at the beginning of issue 4 in the event itself. And part of the reason also I picked this to start with is because the characters, and I didn't talk about this yesterday, but really the only Amalgam characters you get to see do anything at all in the miniseries proper are the Hyena, who is the Joker and Sabretooth combined, and Batman and Dark Claw, who is again Batman and Wolverine combined. So what these do is it's this big stunt thing where it's kind of the comic companies trolling the comic readers, and they made it clear what this was in the first place, but I say trolling because it's kind of all one big joke. There's really not any character stuff to be invested in or stories to be compelled by, and they're not even pretending like that's there, although it's a really bittersweet experience even with the good ones, because if you can call them good, because they're always a part of a greater whole that you never got. We never followed these up with anything. Some of these characters got more than one comic, but they're not, as far as I know, none of them are connected, because I haven't read all of them, but I will be for this series. But as far as I know, none of them are follow-ups to any of the earlier ones, so it's just, here's a book in a style of a comic that you've read before, or comics that you've read before, and then here's that same character, but rendered in kind of a different style. So we have Legends of the Dark Claw, which is, of course, Legends of the Dark Knight, and then later on, we have Dark Claw Adventures, which is done in the Batman the Animated Series style, but is this character. This creative team is really appropriate for this material, and that's one of the things that's kind of fun about these, is seeing which creators they went to, and if you're not familiar with them in the first place, looking them up and seeing what their credentials were for working on the particular mashup they worked on, or if you knew them already. Jim Balent had a long run on Catwoman, and that's what he's most known for in the mid-90s. I've read some of that, but not all of it, and I think his art style is really conducive to this, and I thought Larry Hama was a really interesting choice for this, because he's got creds for both characters. So this is Legends of the Dark Claw. He worked on some of Legends of the Dark Knight during No Man's Land, and he also has worked on some X-Men stuff, specifically things having to do with Wolverine, including a Weapon X story arc in the I think the early 90s. So anyway, the creative team made a lot of sense for this, and what makes it kind of bittersweet is the potential for telling a real story. And there is some of that here. It would have been a lot of fun to see the next chapter of this, and it teases you. You get to the end, and just like a lot of comics, it's like coming up next, and it gives you a chapter heading for what the story is going to be next. And of course, we don't get to go there, and so it's fun to get kind of the snapshot into a world that we're not actually developing. But I feel like if this were done now, it would probably be done in the Flashpoint method, where you have this new universe that has taken over the old one, or the old two in this case, and then you have these tie-ins where we actually flesh those things out. And these characters are fleshed out in the sense that we get to see them longer than just on a cover, and you get to learn some of the backstories and things. But it feels more like a brainstorming experiment, or maybe like a thought exercise, before it feels like actual storytelling and creating characters. It's kind of just, here are these clever ideas we had, and it's this what if idea without going all the way like you would in a what if comic, and actually giving you any kind of a follow-through or a conclusion. What we have here is a total mashup between Batman and Wolverine. He is not more of one than he is of the other, and that's handled really well. That's probably the thing I'm most impressed with this particular issue, is that I feel like I am reading a Batman comic and a Wolverine comic simultaneously, and that's a lot of fun. So we get a lot of backstory crammed in here, because the difficulty with trying to have your cake and eat it too on this is you're going to have one 22-page comic in order to introduce new readers to this character that you just made up, while pretending like you've been writing about this character forever, and telling enough story that it's fun to read, but not actually finishing it. And that's what these are. And so you've got to sit through a whole bunch of exposition. There's a lot more discussion of backstory and a lot more words on a page than you would usually get, because we're trying to cram so much in this to even make it readable. And the backstory that we get here is kind of neat, and again, could have been a really cool jumping-off place for a story, I think, and these ideas are really not here, but inherent in this backstory, I think, is probably a nature versus nurture story, and a free will versus being tied to your nature and not really having a choice in what you are kind of story. So we have in Logan, and importantly, he's not both Logan and Bruce Wayne. He has some components of Bruce Wayne's backstory, but there actually is also a Bruce Wayne in this universe, and we'll get to him a little bit later. But Logan is as a kid at 5 years old, saw his parents gunned down, and then he got sent to live with family in Canada. And there was a horrible tragedy with that, and he ended up being taken in, I guess, by a Mountie, and then he ended up going into the service and became a war hero like Wolverine. And at some point, he ends up going into what is essentially the Weapon X program, along with Creed, who in this gets turned into a version of the Joker called the Hyena. And the idea is that both of them were in the program at the exact same time. One failed, and one was a failure, and one of them was a success. And it was Wolverine. It was Darkclaw. It feels like Wolverine, of course. It was Darkclaw that was the failure. because he couldn't be controlled, just like with Weapon X. But instead of making it a feral animal thing with him, the idea is he makes for a not-so-good weapon because he has a conscience. And so he goes off and is in control of his own fate. And he feels like it's his responsibility to stop his brother in the mad science experiment, the Hyena, who is his opposite in that he, instead of a conscience, is a psychotic person, and he describes as the weapon with an imagination. And so he's very much Creed infused with the Joker, where he has Sabretooth with the Joker, where he has no rhyme or reason to what he does, but he was built that way, and we don't really know anything about what he was like before that, so I don't know how much of that is supposed to come from his personality in the first place, or if he was entirely created this way and none of what he's doing is really his fault, and he's just this unfortunate force of nature or perversion of nature. And so he has this plot where he's trying to take down Air Force One, and that's where it feels much more like a Wolverine comic than it does a Batman comic. So Logan has kind of Batman's temperament, but he's a lot more one-linery like Wolverine, although this era Batman, I think, tended to talk a lot more often than Batman does in comics now. Or at least the way he talks, the kind of quippy, dry humor, kind of stuff that you get here, and but he talks a lot, and he's very no nonsense like Batman is, and he of course has a sidekick, and his sidekick is the Sparrow, who is a merger of Robin and Jubilee, which is really weird. Like, imagine you fall in love with someone and then your universes literally collide and you end up being merged with that person. And then when you get pulled back apart again, if you remember any of that, I just feel like that would be so awkward. You'd probably have a difficult time, continuing to date that person. Or maybe it would make it better because you've had this shared experience where you've been each other for a while, and no one knows you better than the other person because now you've been fused together. That is, as far as I know, maybe there are some others, and maybe we'll run into them as we're looking at these issues, but I think that might be the only cross between genders where you have a man and a woman that combine to form a new character. There's so much goofy, edgy 90s stuff in this. Sparrow doesn't like that her name is Sparrow. Batman came up with that name, and he's like, that's a perfectly fine name, and she thinks it's lame, and her suggestion apparently for her name was Death Urge Overdrive. We did this so much in the 90s where we just put random words together because we thought they kind of sounded cool. Never mind that putting them together, they mean less than each of the words would separately. Death Urge Overdrive. Urge? Like you have an urge to cause death, and that urge is in overdrive. Like, what does that even mean? It makes Negasonic Teenage Warhead sound like the most natural superhero name ever. And anyway, so some of the banter between them is kind of fun, but I think I'm enjoying it somewhat despite itself, where I'm just looking at this in the context of 90s stuff and going, that's not supposed to be funny in the way I'm laughing at it, I don't think, necessarily. And again, I try to have a historical perspective on stuff like this, and it's surreal because it's been a long time, but this was my childhood, so it also doesn't feel, it feels familiar. I feel at home with this stuff, but I also recognize that that a lot of this feels goofy in a way now that it didn't back then, although a lot of people didn't like the stuff even when it was coming out and thought that it was too silly and ham-fisted and would have preferred real stories again as opposed to these snapshots into worlds that we never really develop. The device through which we learn about Darkclaw's background is the Huntress, who is Carol Danvers in this universe, and she's she's trying to get to the bottom of the Hyena's background and ends up stumbling onto Logan's, which I guess is a decent enough way to, as naturally as you possibly can in this, give us that background. Although, if this was a book that had been going on for a long time, unless it had been avoiding origin and was keeping that a secret, if it was like a secret origin thing, you'd think that you'd be reading this and then suddenly, oh great, origin stuff again, I know that already. But I think you have to question the authenticity of the exercise a little bit, because, again, this would have been, this is supposed to be in the middle of a run, like this is a character that you read all the time, and that, and that these characters have all been around for a long time, and Amalgam is the comic company as opposed to DC and Marvel. I would have liked to have seen Amalgam go the whole 9 yards and had fake issue numbers on the covers, where this is like Legends of Dark Claw 67 or 112 or something, sort of like Radioactive Man with its, the Simpsons parody comics of that parodied a lot of superhero stuff, and they always had random numbers that weren't in succession at all. I think it would have been smart and funny to do that with this, especially because we go so far as to have fake letters pages, and I want to read a couple of those because they're amusing. Again, we're pretending like this is that these just are superhero comics that have been going on forever, and that you don't have both houses, and so somebody in in the DC or Marvel office just wrote these and passed them off like real fan letters, and I think that's kind of funny. I'll read one or two of these. Dear Dark Claw staff, I'm very pleased indeed with the current creative team on Dark Claw, and I am thrilled that the Taloned Avenger is getting his own title at last. Oh, okay, so we are pretending like this is the first issue. Okay, I guess that kind of makes sense. If each of these, because again, I've only read a couple of these, and it's been a long time, and there are a lot of these that I've not looked at at all. So it might be that each of them plays as a way to get the origin out, and it's the first issue, and then there would have been a whole series, but we just didn't write them. I guess that's supposed to be the idea, but I think this is funny. I remember Mr. Balance work from John Jones' Vampire Hunter, I wish they'd made that, and Prince Namor, the Aquaman, and I thought it was quite impressive back then, but lately it seems he has really found his style and brought his drawing ability right up to the stellar level. I won't read the rest of that, but I just thought John Jones' Vampire Hunter was pretty funny. Dear creators, thank you for remembering that there are a few of us left who appreciate a good story and who actually read the comic instead of bagging it in mint condition. I know you have to answer to the accountants and lawyers who run the corporation, and you have to make concessions to the sales department who pressure you to have big events and crossovers and metallic covers with die cuts and holograms. It is a lot to stand up against. I just wanted to thank you for caring about the characters as much as the ordinary reader and giving us stories with real human impact. Okay, that's hilarious because obviously, that's the companies being self-aware and poking fun at themselves with all of the gimmicks and things that they were doing at this time, but this was right around when the crash happened, and so they are digging their own grave while they're making that joke. And some people even point to Amalgam as one of the many kind of gimmicks that led to the crash. These things were super mass-produced. They're very easy to find. They haven't been in print since then, which is not surprising given that it's the two companies coming together to make this, and I don't know which of them, like I don't know if they would have to come back together again somehow in order to reprint them, or if each of them have the rights to put these back out again, but it's neither here nor there if you can order things on the internet, because these are, if you buy out a collection of 90s stuff, you're going to find these. I do, as I said, like the art in this a lot, especially this 2-page spread with Dark Claw and Hyena toward the beginning. That kind of brings me back. It's very nostalgic for me. I liked Balance art a lot on the Catwoman that I read when I was a kid. It's unabashedly exaggerated, which is something I always liked, and I always thought that it was really atmospheric. The very end of this is Darkclaw about to take down the Hyena. He's on Air Force One, and they're fighting, and then Hyena seems to have gotten away, and he's about to go chase after him, and then next issue, this crossbow. So much of this and this in comics, and that's kind of making fun of that whole thing. And then that's it. You don't get any more. So there's not really a lot of thematic stuff to analyze. As I said, you can kind of glean into some things and where you might take this, and it might be a fun exercise. It might have been, when I was a kid, kind of a fun exercise to take this and go, okay, what happens next, and then try to write the next issue myself or something. But that's kind of what it's good for, is just sparking your imagination and trying to guess what more of this would be like, and what you would continue to do with a blending of these things. It's a fun gag. It's a fun novelty, I suppose. But I really do kind of wish that these had been miniseries as opposed to just one shots, and that even if they were truncated stories, we'd actually paid them off. It does feel a little bit too much like trolling, especially since you're buying these and each of them is incomplete. But we're gonna take a look at another one tomorrow. And in the meantime, thanks a lot for watching. I'm Captain Logan, and happy reading.